I was 6 years old when my parents discovered something about me I never wanted them to exploit: the ability to cry on command. Not shallow, performative tears, but the kind that came from deep inside. The ones that could make strangers' hearts ache and their wallets open. At the time, I didn't understand the gravity of this discovery. I only knew that hunger, fear, and confusion were suddenly tools in their hands, and I had become the instrument. Our home was small and cluttered, with faded wallpaper peeling in the corners and a lingering smell of stale food that never quite left the air. It wasn't merely poverty. It was a carefully maintained environment of scarcity, one where coins, scraps of food, and every small gesture of kindness from strangers could be leveraged for survival. Mom and Dad moved through this world like opportunists, not helpless people. Every glance, every sigh, every subtle movement of my body became a potential asset, a way to bend the sympathy of the outside world to their will. The first real incident happened in a grocery store. We went there as a matter of routine, navigating the fluorescent-lit aisles lined with overripe produce and discounted goods. Mom counted coins over and over, muttering under her breath, and when the total came up short, something inside me reacted. Hunger had been a constant companion for as long as I could remember, but this time, it surged into uncontrollable tears. They flowed freely, natural and raw, and in that moment, a stranger, a woman with worn shoes and a kind smile, reached into her purse and handed Mom $40. I watched Mom's expression change in a way I would never forget. Her eyes widened, a slow smile spreading across her face like she had unearthed hidden treasure. That night, the training began. Pinches on my arm, whispered instructions about how to make each sob believable, and careful timing. All of it became a ritual. Mom guided me as if I were a marionette, shaping my body and voice to evoke maximum pity. Each movement, each intake of breath, each trembling hand was choreographed to perfection. By 7, I no longer needed the pinches. A simple throat clear from Mom, and my tears would fall, effortlessly and convincingly. Dad timed my sobs on his phone, proudly announcing 30 seconds from cue to full-blown despair. The rules were strict and absolute. Never use the same location twice in a month. Always wear the same faded pink dress to signal vulnerability. Maintain eye contact but never speak unless prompted. And never, under any circumstances, reveal the truth of what we were doing. Even at such a young age, I became acutely aware of my role. Play and laughter faded from my life, replaced by rehearsals and calculations. The world became a stage, and I had learned to perform under constant scrutiny. I began noticing patterns, faces in the crowd, subtle gestures, who was likely to give and who would hesitate. My parents documented everything meticulously: which stores we visited, which days worked best, the type of strangers who were most easily moved. Our house itself turned into a rehearsal space. Coins scattered on the mattress served as visual, reminders of my successes or failures. The cracked bathroom mirror reflected not only my sobs, but also the precision of my performance. Nights were filled with silent practice, adjusting expressions, tilting my head, controlling my hands, perfecting the quiver of my lips. Play and childhood freedom were stripped away. My existence revolved around mastering a skill forced upon me. Psychologically, the experience left deep scars. I became hyper-aware, constantly analyzing strangers' reactions, anticipating their responses, and adjusting my performance. My emotions, once spontaneous and natural, were now tools to manipulate, and I was simultaneously proud of my skill and ashamed of being used. Nights were the hardest, lying awake in darkness, listening to the faint clinking of coins as my parents counted their gains, understanding that my pain had become currency. Even small errands became exercises in strategy. I learned when to allow the first tear to fall, how to pace the sobs, how to make my hands tremble just enough to appear vulnerable without seeming unwell. I began memorizing the environment, where strangers parked, which aisles were busiest, how long it took for compassion to turn into action. Every detail mattered. Every moment was rehearsed. Every tear was a calculated investment in survival. By the end of that first year, I had internalized the mechanics completely. The skills my parents forced me to cultivate were no longer just survival tools. They were the lens through which I viewed human nature. I could predict reactions, sense motives, and manipulate attention with subtlety that far exceeded my age. But each step deeper into this practice also drew me further from innocence, from the carefree life of a child, and from the possibility of ever knowing simple, unforced joy. Mom and Dad weren't simply scraping by. They had mastered the art of turning scarcity into performance. Every gesture, every sigh, every glance was meticulously calculated to provoke reactions from the world outside our small, cluttered apartment. Mom moved like an actress on stage, her threadbare coat clinging to her frame, her expressions of despair practiced until they could evoke sympathy at the faintest glance. Dad crouched under the hood of our battered sedan, tools in hand, pretending helplessness while orchestrating his own version of a tragedy. Looking back, I realized it wasn't incompetence. They were deliberate, opportunistic, and cunning. They had learned that human compassion could be molded and monetized, and that my tears could be the most potent weapon in their arsenal. I began noticing patterns almost immediately. A neighbor passing by would prompt Mom to tug at her frayed coat in just the right way, emphasizing vulnerability, tilting her head, letting her eyes glisten as though the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. Dad's tinkering would occasionally produce a puff of smoke or a clatter from under the hood, enough to draw attention without raising suspicion of any real skill or knowledge. I could sense the anticipation in their movements, the satisfaction when strangers reacted, softly at first, first with a small offer of help, and later with a willingness to part with bills or coins. Even as a child, I understood that these weren't mere coincidences. They were orchestrated, rehearsed, and refined acts designed to bend human empathy into serviceable currency. Then came the discovery of my own unique contribution, tears that could be summoned at will. What had once been spontaneous emotion became a tool to be honed, sharpened, and deployed at precise moments. Mom and Dad taught me how to perfect it, sometimes gently encouraging, sometimes pinching or jostling me to elicit the right expression of pain. I learned the timing of sobs, the way to quiver my lips, the subtle tremor in my hands, and the gentle tilt of my head that made strangers believe I was in genuine distress. The sensation was strange, even frightening at first, to feel my emotions taken from me, reshaped, and used as a commodity. Yet at the same time, I felt an odd sense of control. I could summon tears like a spell, a power that belonged entirely to me, and yet was entirely for them. Our home quickly transformed into a training ground. Cracked mirrors in the hallway reflected my expressions so that I could adjust them, perfecting each detail of my performance. Coins counted and stacked on our thin mattress became a record of success and failure, tangible proof that my efforts had yielded results. Sleep became an afterthought as I rehearsed late into the night, whispering cues to myself, practicing variations and sobs, calibrating my voice, and refining the trembling of my hands. My toys were few, but the world outside provided endless opportunities for practice. Every trip to a grocery store, every outing to a parking lot, every walk past strangers became a stage, and I was learning to perform with precision, even when fatigue made my body tremble. The psychological toll was enormous. Even as I mastered the skill of controlled sorrow, my emotions ceased to feel fully my own. Pride in my effectiveness mingled uneasily with shame and confusion. I learned to measure my worth not by who I was, but by how much sympathy I could elicit, how effectively I could move strangers. Nights were often the hardest, lying awake and hearing the faint clink of coins as my parents counted the rewards of my performance. I became acutely aware of the currency of my suffering and of the cost of disobedience or failure. With every passing day, my childhood innocence eroded, replaced by a keen understanding of manipulation and the mechanics of influence. Their system was precise. Mom and Dad mapped out territories like generals planning a campaign. They scheduled grocery stores, parking lots, and medical offices in a rotating pattern to avoid suspicion, always ensuring that strangers would encounter the right level of vulnerability at the right time. Mom's frayed coat, Dad's helpless, tinkering, my tears, all were carefully orchestrated elements of a larger strategy. I became both the performer and the instrument of their design, understanding the subtleties of human behavior, who would respond with immediate generosity, who would hesitate, who could be coaxed, and who would remain indifferent. My young mind became a laboratory for observation and application, absorbing lessons in human psychology that children normally don't learn until much later in life. By the time I was 7, I had become expert in reading faces and predicting responses. I could sense the subtle cues that indicated empathy, the slight tightening of lips that betrayed discomfort or suspicion, the fleeting glance that revealed recognition. I learned to pace my tears, to gauge the intensity of sobs, and to modulate my expressions to suit the audience. Some days, I could earn hundreds of dollars before noon, each coin a testament to my skill, yet each also a reminder of my captivity within this system. The lessons went beyond simple performance. They instilled in me an understanding of power, persuasion, and the fragility of human kindness. The consequences of this upbringing were profound. My school attendance suffered. My childhood was truncated, and my understanding of trust and relationships became complicated. My parents' actions had placed me at the center of a world where honesty and deception intertwined, where empathy could be manipulated, and where my emotions were currency. I learned to adapt, survive, and master my performance, but at the cost of a part of my identity. The child who once played freely was replaced by someone who measured every interaction, who calculated the potential of each tier, and who understood the dangerous power of vulnerability. And yet, in the midst of this, I began to comprehend the duality of my existence. I was both a victim and a prodigy, exploited and empowered. The skills I had honed, the observations I had made, and the subtle control I had developed over human emotion were my inheritance as much as they were my burden. I realized that every tear I shed, every gesture I performed, carried lessons that would follow me for the rest of my life, shaping how I saw the world and how I navigated it. I had been forced to grow up too quickly, but in that forced maturity lay a foundation for resilience, observation, and an understanding of human nature that few ever acquire. The moment I discovered that my tears could be summoned at will was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Before that, crying had been purely instinctual, a natural reaction to fear, pain, or frustration, something private and intimate. But once my parents realized that I could produce genuine, gut-wrenching sobs on demand, I became aware that my emotions were no longer mine alone. They were a currency, a weapon, and a tool of survival in my parents' hands. I remember the first time it truly clicked. Mom had dragged me to a grocery store that smelled faintly of mildew and old produce, her eyes scanning the shelves in panic. back. When I expressed genuine hunger, tears streaming down my cheeks, a stranger handed her $40. The rush of power, the realization that my small body could move someone to action was intoxicating and terrifying. From that day, my sobs were no longer a private expression. They were rehearsed, sharpened, perfected, and deployed for maximum effect. Mom and Dad began teaching me the art of performance with the precision of seasoned instructors. Sometimes it was gentle encouragement, a quiet whisper that coaxed me to tilt my head just so, or a light touch that guided my hand to tremble at the right moment. Other times it was harsher, a pinch, a tug, a sharp gesture meant to draw out the right expression from my body. I learned to time my sobs to match the emotional cues of strangers, to pace my tears so that they would appear authentic but not exaggerated, to quiver my lips in a rhythm that seemed natural and vulnerable. Their techniques were relentless, shaping my body into an instrument, molding my mind into a calculating observer of human behavior. I began to understand that the power of my body lay not in strength but in subtlety, in a slow quiver, in the glisten of tears, in a tilt of the head that could pierce the heart of a stranger. Every outing became a stage, and I learned to navigate it with meticulous care. We mapped our territories like generals preparing for battle. Grocery stores on Mondays, medical office parking lots on Tuesdays, public transport stations on Wednesdays. Mom's frayed coat and pitiful expressions were props. Dad's tinkering under the hood of our old sedan was an act designed to draw attention without suspicion. I, the child, became the centerpiece, performing my part with precision and awareness beyond my years. The lessons I learned extended far beyond mere mimicry. They were lessons in human psychology. I observed every nuance, how a slight frown could elicit more help than a desperate plea, how eye contact could forge an immediate connection, and how hesitation often led to empathy. I became an expert in reading faces and anticipating reactions, mastering the art of influence without ever realizing it at first. The mornings were the hardest. Before the sun even rose, I would rehearse my expressions in the cracked mirror of our hallway, testing variations of sorrow, practicing the quiver of my hands and lips, the tilt of my head, and the subtle tremor in my voice. The night before, coins had been counted and stacked on our thin mattress, proof of the previous day's success, evidence that my performance had yielded results. Yet each coin was also a reminder of my captivity. Sleep became scarce, and dreams were often interrupted by rehearsals or by the echoes of my parents' expectations. They watched closely, critiquing my performances, instructing me on minor adjustments that could enhance my realism. In this way, my childhood became a laboratory, a controlled environment where emotion was observed, measured, and refined with scientific precision. Over time, I became acutely aware of my own power and the cost it carried. With each tear, I could manipulate a stranger's compassion, redirect their attention, and compel them to act. I understood the mechanics of sympathy, the triggers that elicited generosity, and the vulnerabilities in human behavior that I could exploit. And yet, while I honed these skills, I also felt an internal isolation that grew with every rehearsal. Other children played without restraint, laughed without calculation, and shared spontaneous joy that I could no longer fully access. My life was measured in performances and observations. Every interaction became a lesson in control, influence, and subtle coercion. I was learning, refining, and executing, but at the expense of my innocence. The intensity of my training escalated with each passing day. We kept detailed notes on the success of our strategies, cataloging the reactions of strangers as if preparing for a war campaign. Tuesday at the suburban Target, Thursday at the medical plaza. Each encounter was logged with precision. Mom experimented with props, trying handkerchiefs or worn toys, but always returned to the simplest, most effective element: my tears, pure, unadulterated, and under command. Dad timed me with his phone, recording the duration of sobs, proudly announcing 30 seconds to full heartbreak. That's my girl. With each measurement, my skill grew, my awareness sharpened, and my understanding of human emotion deepened. I was becoming a master of manipulation, but also a prisoner to the expectations of my own family. School became secondary to my role as the family instrument of persuasion. Absences were frequent, fatigue constant. When I did attend, I would often drift to sleep at my desk, counting coins in my head instead of focusing on lessons. I began cataloging potential opportunities in my mind: which parking lots, which neighborhoods, which times of day were most likely to yield results. The world of childhood, with its parks and movies and carefree laughter, existed only as a distant dream. My peers could not understand, could not see the precision with which I was trained, the careful orchestration of my movements, the necessity of every tear. By the time I was 9, my reputation preceded me. Familiar faces in stores recognized me, some even attempting to bypass cash donations with groceries instead. I watched, detached and analytical, as Mom pretended to shop while I dried my cheeks and waited for the next cue. Yet even as I perfected my craft, I began to recognize the cost of mastery. My own emotions became a commodity, separated from the spontaneity and joy that once defined childhood. Each successful performance reinforced a duality within me: skill and exploitation, power and captivity, observation and performance. I became keenly aware of my influence over others, but also painfully conscious of the ways my parents had trapped me in this system. There was an invisible tension in every tier, a silent struggle between obedience and self-preservation, between the exhilaration of control and the fear of exposure. I learned to live in this tension, to navigate it with care, and to continue performing with precision even as the consequences of my upbringing imprinted themselves indelibly upon my young mind. From the moment my parents realized that my tears could be summoned on command, they didn't just acknowledge it, they weaponized it. It became clear very quickly that nothing about our survival was left to chance, and I was the instrument around which their entire strategy revolved. Mom treated every outing as if it were a stage production, meticulously rehearsing me in front of mirrors, in hallways, even at the kitchen table. Her instructions were precise. Tilt your head slightly, let the light catch the moisture in your eyes, quiver your lips ever so slightly before allowing the first tear to fall. I learned the science of tears, not just when to cry, but how to make every tear count. A single poorly timed glimmer could ruin an interaction, or worse, make someone suspect that our despair wasn't genuine. I practiced in secret, whispering, and sobbing into the cracked mirror, imagining the reactions of strangers as if they were an audience I had to manipulate. Dad complimented her direction with measured calculation. He timed my sobs with a stopwatch, noting how long it took to elicit a reaction. 30 seconds, 45 seconds, sometimes a full minute of gradual escalation to peak despair. He critiqued every movement, every posture, every slight tremor in my hands. Straighten your back, he would say, but not too rigid. Vulnerability looks natural, not staged. I quickly realized that he measured everything: the distance between me and the stranger, the pace of my breathing, the angle of my gaze, even the volume of my voice. Nothing was accidental, nothing left to chance. It was a precise operation, a symphony of deception with me as the lead instrument. Each outing required complete adherence to their methods, and any deviation could result in failure that often carried its own form of punishment or criticism. They devised entire routes for missions, identifying locations with optimal sympathetic potential. Grocery stores, medical parking lots, bus stations, even playgrounds became mapped territories where my performance could yield the maximum financial gain. Mom would station me at strategic points where the visibility was highest, whispering instructions through subtle touches. Dad would wait nearby under the guise of car maintenance, silently recording, observing, and analyzing every interaction. The preparation was intense. We discussed potential obstacles, rehearsed reactions to different types of people, and devised backup plans if our primary target didn't respond. Every detail mattered. Even the smallest hesitation on my part could alert someone to the manipulation, so I had to internalize the rhythm, the pacing, and the emotional cadence required for success. Training sessions extended far beyond public outings. In our apartment, every mirror became a tool for refining my technique. I studied the subtleties of facial expression, the way a lip quiver combined with a trembling hand could produce maximum empathy, how the eyes could convey despair without uttering a single word. Mom coached me relentlessly, sometimes gently, adjusting my posture, other times applying a pinch or nudge to elicit a more authentic expression. These physical cues became the framework upon which I built my emotional arsenal. I had to feel the sadness, inhabit it completely, while simultaneously calculating its effect on those who would witness it. It was exhausting, immersive, and completely inescapable. The psychological complexity of my position grew as I aged. I became acutely aware of my power over strangers, and yet also conscious of my parents' domination over me. I was both the weapon and the captive, both empowered and trapped. I observed each person I targeted with meticulous attention: the woman with the designer purse who would clutch it tighter at first, the older man whose own grandchildren reminded him of me, the young mother whose guilt over small mistakes was immediate and palpable. I learned to adjust my sobs for maximum impact, tailoring my expressions to each individual's likely response. This was no longer child's play. It was psychological strategy at an advanced level. School became secondary to my role as the family's financial instrument. Absences mounted, and exhaustion was constant. On the rare days I attended, I would drift in and out of focus, calculating opportunities and outcomes even as teachers discussed lessons I could no longer fully absorb. My peers spoke of playgrounds and birthday parties. I cataloged parking lots, timings, and patterns of human behavior. Every interaction with adults outside our family was analyzed and recorded mentally, compared against prior experiences, and integrated into a continuously evolving strategy. Even the smallest gestures, an unintended sympathetic glance, a distracted expression, became data points that informed future performances. The moral and emotional consequences were profound. Each tear that brought us food, cash, or survival was also a reminder of my captivity. I was learning to weaponize my own emotions, to control my body in service of someone else's greed. Yet, with every performance, I became more skilled, more aware, and more detached from ordinary childhood experiences. Play, spontaneity, and joy were foreign concepts. They belonged to other children in other lives. My world had become a stage, my emotions a commodity, and my very identity entwined with the meticulous exploitation by my parents. Over time, I developed a deep awareness of the human psyche. I learned to anticipate reactions, to manipulate empathy, and to execute every performance with precision. I could gauge a stranger's emotional state in seconds, knowing exactly which expressions would draw the desired response. The lines between instinct and calculation blurred, until every tear, every tremor, every sigh became both a tool and a chain. I had become adept at deception, but in doing so, I had also created a prison from which my own childhood could not escape. My skills had grown, but so had the awareness of my loss. Even in moments of quiet, when I rehearsed alone in front of the mirror, I felt the weight of my dual reality. I was empowered and imprisoned, trained to perfection, yet robbed of innocence. Every detail, head tilt, lip quiver, tear formation, and hand movement, was perfected, calculated, and executed. My life became a delicate balance between survival, performance, and moral compromise. compromise, a world where every human interaction was both a lesson and a test. The meticulous orchestration of my talents by my parents created a reality where childhood innocence was replaced by strategic mastery, and where my tears, once private and emotional, became instruments of both influence and captivity. Our home gradually became less of a living space and more of a training ground, a place where every corner and object had a purpose in perfecting my craft. The cracked mirrors on the walls were not merely reflections, they were tools of scrutiny. I would study my face for hours, watching the way a single tear traced the curve of my cheek, the subtle quiver of my lips, and the tiny catch in my breath that could signal real despair. Each reflection demanded perfection, and each imperfection felt like failure. I began to understand that my body could be read like a book, each emotion a line in a story designed to elicit responses from strangers. The mattress on the floor, scattered with coins and bills, became my scoreboard. Every coin represented a small victory, a proof that my tears could translate into survival, a tangible measure of success in a system built entirely on performance. Evenings were not for rest or play, they were for practice. While other children ran, laughed, and dreamed, I whispered lines to myself, rehearsing gestures and expressions in the dim glow of a single lamp. I adjusted the tilt of my head, the flutter of my hands, the cadence of my sobs. Every movement, every sigh, every small detail was rehearsed with meticulous care. The world beyond our apartment had become a stage, and I was both the performer and the instrument of a show that my parents directed with obsessive precision. I learned to read people as carefully as I read my own reflection. An eyebrow lifted, a glance averted, the way someone's shoulders slumped under sympathy. These cues dictated how I would tilt my head, when a tear would drop, how my body would tremble. Nothing was left to chance. Everything was orchestrated. My childhood was stripped away in the process. There were no toys to occupy my hands, no playgrounds to explore, no carefree laughter to fill my lungs. Instead, I was immersed in the mechanics of manipulation. I practiced summoning despair on demand, controlling the swell of emotion within me, and channeling it outward with precision. I could feel a rush of sorrow build in my chest, timing it to the exact moment when a passerby's attention would be drawn to me. I became an expert at calibrating my emotions, learning when to make my hands shake just enough to seem vulnerable, when to let a sob catch in my throat, when a quiver in my lips could tug at someone's heartstrings. At first, the lessons were small, almost imperceptible, but they grew in intensity and sophistication. Mom would nudge me, pinch my arm, or whisper sharp corrections to perfect the subtlety of my expressions. Dad would use his phone to time me, noting the speed with which tears fell, the exact duration it took to reach a believable crescendo. He critiqued posture and hand movements, demanding I project a helplessness that was convincing but never sickly, a sorrow that was authentic enough to provoke generosity, but controlled enough to avoid suspicion. It felt like being drafted into an elite army, where the only weapons were my own body and emotions, and failure had consequences we could not afford. The patterns became systematic. Mom created scripts in her mind, where to tilt my head, how to glisten my eyes, when to let the first tear escape. Dad handled logistics, timing, and location, choosing moments when strangers were vulnerable or already emotionally charged. Together, they constructed a curriculum of human empathy that I had to master at a young age. I memorized their rules: never use the same location twice in a month, wear the same pitiful outfit consistently, maintain eye contact but never speak unless prompted. My every action was dictated, rehearsed, and scrutinized. The entire city became my classroom, and I the most dedicated student, learning the exact mechanics of influence and manipulation. Even when alone, practice never ceased. I would speak to myself in whispers, adjusting expressions and gestures until they felt authentic. I rehearsed tears, sobs, and the smallest motions of vulnerability. In those quiet hours, I became intensely aware of my power, the ability to summon real despair on demand. This talent, once intimate and private, had been transformed into a tool for survival and an object of control. Every emotion I felt was filtered through strategy and purpose. The home, the mirrors, the coins, the whispered instructions, all became extensions of a world where nothing was accidental and every tear was calculated. I also became a keen observer of human behavior. Each passerby, each potential donor, each person who paused or lingered was analyzed, cataloged, and studied. I learned which gestures evoked the strongest reactions and which subtle details were most persuasive. A glance downward, a trembling hand, a quivering lip, all were weapons I wielded with precision. I learned to anticipate emotions before they even manifested, to manipulate sympathy through a combination of appearance, timing, and controlled vulnerability. The world outside became a testing ground, a theater in which my skills were deployed, with exacting precision, and every interaction reinforced the lessons I had learned at home. Through all this, I realized my childhood innocence had been stripped away, replaced with skill, strategy, and acute awareness. I could summon genuine tears on demand, control the ebb and flow of my emotions, and project despair so convincingly that strangers responded as if my sorrow were their own. Yet with each success, I felt the tension of living a double life, the performer trained to manipulate and the child who longed for ordinary experiences. The home, once a sanctuary, had become both workshop and prison, and every day was a rehearsal for survival in a world that demanded emotional mastery for even the smallest comforts. Even as I mastered the art of producing tears on command, the psychological burden weighed heavily upon me. What had started as a curious observation, my own capacity for raw, unfiltered emotion, was no longer mine to own. Each sob, each quiver of the lips, each tear sliding down my cheek was co-opted by my parents as an instrument in their relentless pursuit of survival, or at least what they claimed survival to be. The pride I felt in eliciting sympathy from strangers was quickly intertwined with shame. I had become effective, yes, but that effectiveness was measured not by my character or by accomplishments that had meaning to me, but by my ability to manipulate the emotions of others. My tears, once a natural response to hunger, fear, or sadness, were now commodified, turning my childhood into a ledger of calculated sorrow. At night, the weight of what I had become pressed in on me most acutely. I lay awake on our threadbare mattress, listening to the faint clinking of coins as my parents counted their ill-gotten gains, the sound echoing through our cramped apartment. The metallic tinkle, which in a normal household might have signified ordinary household chores, or the soft background noise of city life, had become a grim metronome, measuring the cost of my suffering in tangible, almost unbearable increments. Each coin represented another act of manipulation, another tear forced from me, another stranger swayed by the manufactured appearance of vulnerability. The realization settled deep in my chest. My body and emotions were no longer mine. They had become instruments, calibrated and honed, a tool wielded with precision and expectation. The duality of pride and shame created an emotional dissonance that was impossible to reconcile. On the one hand, there was the undeniable thrill of being effective, of seeing a stranger hand over money, of witnessing the immediate power my sorrow commanded. On the other hand, each act reminded me that my parents had stolen from me the very innocence that made such expressions natural and authentic. I measured my worth by external responses, not by any internal metric of identity or achievement. The mastery of this skill became a requirement, a performance that had to be sustained daily, yet it left me emotionally hollow, as though each tear drained a small piece of myself. Isolation compounded this burden. No one outside our family could know the truth of our daily operations. Each outing, each calculated display had to be executed with precision. Even small mistakes, a tear that fell too late or an expression that seemed forced, could compromise the act, resulting in immediate correction from my parents, whether through admonishment, sharp gestures, or painful pinches designed to remind me of the stakes. I was constantly aware that my emotions were not merely observed. They were evaluated, critiqued, and adjusted to suit the needs of others. This constant surveillance created an internal pressure that was exhausting, leaving little room for spontaneity or natural play. My understanding of human behavior, sharpened by this intense training, became both a gift and a curse. I could read subtle cues with extraordinary accuracy, anticipating how a stranger might react to my expressions, what gestures would trigger empathy, and what would be ignored. This skill, while powerful, was rooted in trauma. Each successful elicitation of coins or assistance reinforced the transactional nature of my interactions with the world. I was learning to navigate human emotion with surgical precision, yet every lesson came at the cost of my own emotional freedom. My identity was being molded around the needs of others, leaving me estranged from my own desires and feelings. The house itself became a crucible for this transformation. Every corner, every cracked mirror, every piece of worn furniture was part of the larger narrative my parents constructed. Mirrors were not for vanity, but for practice, allowing me to critique every aspect of my performance. The angle of my gaze, the timing of my tears, the subtle shiver in my hands that signaled vulnerability without weakness. Coins on the mattress were counted meticulously, tangible markers of success that tied directly to my ability to evoke pity. Our home was not a sanctuary, but a rehearsal space, where the art of manipulation was drilled into me with relentless repetition. Nights were particularly grueling. While other children my age dreamed of playgrounds, toys, or friends, I rehearsed expressions, practiced gestures, and whispered scripts to myself in the dim light. I learned to summon tears at will, to calibrate their intensity, and to anticipate the reactions of strangers even before they occurred. The real world was a stage, and I had been cast in a role that demanded perfection. Every day became a test of endurance, a meticulous exercise in controlling my body and my emotions to suit the goals of my parents. There was no room for error, and no relief from the constant evaluation that defined my existence. Even when I succeeded, the victories were hollow. Each act of manipulation reinforced the very structures that oppressed me, creating a cycle that was difficult to break. My ability to influence others became the metric of my value, and any lapse in effectiveness was met with immediate consequences. I was simultaneously celebrated and exploited, praised for my skill but reminded incessantly of the stakes. The psychological strain was immense, leaving me with an acute awareness that my body and emotions were not merely observed. They were controlled. The sense of power that came with my abilities was inseparable from the sense of entrapment. I could evoke deep sympathy, influence human behavior, and command attention, yet all of it was dictated by my parents' whims and plans. I had been drafted into an intricate, high-stakes game, where the rules were opaque and the penalties for failure were severe. The knowledge that I could bend others' emotions at will was intoxicating, yet it was grounded in a constant fear of reprisal, creating a tension between agency and subjugation that defined my early years. Over time, this intricate system of performance, observation, and manipulation became internalized. I measured my own worth by my ability to produce results, to meet the expectations of my parents, and to avoid the consequences of failure. My personal identity became inextricably tied to the effectiveness of my performances, leaving me unable to separate who I was from the role I was forced to play. My emotions, once organic organic and spontaneous, were now tools, instruments in a machine that I did not control. The psychological toll was profound, shaping my understanding of self, trust, and human relationships in ways that would ripple far into adulthood. Even in moments of apparent success, I felt the weight of my circumstances. Each coin earned, each act of sympathy elicited, reinforced the pattern of submission and exploitation. I became acutely aware of the duality of my existence, a skilled performer in the eyes of strangers, a controlled asset in the eyes of my parents, yet a child stripped of authentic experience. The mastery of this craft, while impressive, was inseparable from the loss of freedom, the erosion of self, and the profound awareness that my emotional labor was not a choice, but a requirement. The line between reality and performance blurred. I learned to navigate the world through calculated gestures, refined expressions, and carefully orchestrated displays of vulnerability. I became an expert in human behavior, understanding what would provoke generosity, empathy, or action. Yet, every interaction reminded me that my life was not my own, that my emotions and experiences were instruments to serve the designs of others. The knowledge of my own influence was both empowering and devastating, a constant reminder of the price of survival in a household where love and care were inseparable from exploitation. As I lay awake night after night, listening to the faint sounds of my parents counting coins, I realized that my childhood had been converted into a series of performances. Every day, every interaction, every tear and quiver of the lips was measured, evaluated, and used to extract gain from the world around me. My sense of self became entwined with my ability to perform, leaving me suspended in a state of constant tension between skill and subjugation, pride and shame, agency and exploitation. The psychological weight of this experience shaped every aspect of my early life. My emotions were no longer private, my identity was constantly under scrutiny, and my value was determined not by my inherent qualities, but by the reactions I could provoke in others. The mastery of my craft was inseparable from the oppression that produced it, creating a childhood defined by control, calculation, and the relentless commodification of innocence. I became, in essence, both artist and tool, performer and prisoner, bound by a system I had no choice but to obey. Even as I grew older and refined my skills, the imprint of this experience remained. The lessons I learned about human behavior, manipulation, and the power of emotional display became intertwined with profound trauma. I had been trained to observe, calculate, and influence, yet my own needs and desires were consistently subordinated to the demands of survival within the family. The tension between mastery and exploitation, pride and shame, remained a defining force in my development, leaving a legacy of both skill and psychological burden that would influence every future interaction, every attempt at independence, and every negotiation of power and trust.